You think constitutional rights apply to you in my courtroom, boy? Judge Mildred Vance sneered, her wooden gavel suspended in the air like an executioner's axe. You are nothing but a thug in a cheap suit, and I am the law in this county. 30 days in maximum security for contempt. Let's see if your arrogant attitude improves behind bars. Victor Blackwood didn't flinch. He slowly adjusted the frayed cuffs of his thrift store shirt, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a chilling, predatory calm that made the bailiff shift uncomfortably. You just made the biggest mistake of your career, Your Honor. The J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C., is a hulking fortress of brutalist concrete, a monument to federal power that casts a long, imposing shadow over Pennsylvania Avenue. Inside, on the top floor, the air was perpetually cool, filtered, and thick with the gravity of national security. Here, in the director's suite, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock and the soft rustle of highly classified dossiers. Victor Blackwood sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk, his broad shoulders framed by the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. At 48, Victor was a man carved from obsidian and sheer will. He was a former federal prosecutor, a veteran of the Bureau's elite anti-corruption task forces, and, as of 6 months ago, the newly appointed director of the FBI. His appointment had been historic, a black man taking the helm in a building named after a man who had famously weaponized the agency against civil rights leaders. Victor carried that irony with him every day, using it not as a burden, but as a whetstone to sharpen his resolve. Currently, his dark, piercing eyes were locked onto a thick red folder laying open on his desk. The gold-embossed letters on the tab read, Operation Blind Justice, Target, Vance, Mildred. The statistics are statistically impossible, Director, said Special Agent Marcus Thorne, Victor's second-in-command, a grizzled veteran with a face map of stress lines. Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the Capitol Dome. In Oak Haven County, Georgia, Judge Mildred Vance sentences black defendants to the maximum allowable penalty 89% of the time. White defendants with identical charges receive probation or minimum sentences in 92% of cases. But it's not just racial animus. It's a business. Victor slowly turned a page in the dossier. The private prison kickbacks. Exactly. Thorne nodded, stepping away from the window and tapping a finger on a spreadsheet projected onto the wall monitor. Oak Haven Correctional is owned by Vanguard Corrections. Every time Vance maxes out a sentence, Vanguard gets a state subsidy. We've tracked offshore wire transfers from Vanguard shell companies into a trust in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary of the trust is Vance's sister-in-law. Then we have her on Title 18 U.S.C. Section 242 Deprivation of Rights under color of law. Plus federal bribery and wire fraud, Victor said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded instant obedience. So why hasn't the Civil Rights Division moved in? Because she owns the county, Victor, Thorne sighed, using the director's first name in the privacy of the office. The local police chief is her golfing buddy. The district attorney is her former clerk. They scrub the transcripts. They intimidate witnesses. We've sent 2 undercover agents down there, posing as defendants. Both times, her clerks flagged their fabricated backgrounds, and Vance dismissed the charges with a slap on the wrist. She can smell a federal agent from a mile away. She only preys on those she believes are genuinely powerless. Victor closed the red folder. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. A dangerous, calculated silence filled the office. Thorne knew that look. It was the look Victor got right before he dismantled an organized crime syndicate. She needs a victim, Victor said softly. Someone who fits her precise demographic prejudice. Someone with no apparent resources, no political connections, and a background that doesn't trigger her clerk's federal alarms. We don't have an agent who fits the bill perfectly right now, Director. The ones who do are deep cover in cartel operations. I wasn't talking about an agent, Marcus. Thorne blinked, his eyes widening as he stared at his boss. Victor. No, absolutely not. You are the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You answer directly to the Attorney General and the President of the United States. You cannot go deep cover in a backwater Georgia county as a common street vagrant. I am the only one who can, Victor stated, standing up. He towered over the desk, an imposing figure of authority. My face isn't widely known to the general public yet. I've intentionally avoided the press circuit since my confirmation. We create a watertight, backstopped alias. Victor Hayes, an out-of-work mechanic from out-of-state passing through Oak Haven. No family, no money, minor priors we plant in the NCIC database. If things go south, you'll be locked in a private prison run by corrupt guards on Vance's payroll. If they find out who you really are, you could be killed before we can breach the facility. Then make sure you're fast on the breach, Marcus, Victor said, a grim smile playing on his lips. Judge Mildred Vance has spent 20 years playing God with the lives of the marginalized. It is time she met someone she cannot break. 3 days later, the director of the FBI ceased to exist. Gone were the $4,000 tailored Brioni suits, the Patek Philippe watch, and the aura of untouchable federal power. In their place was Victor Hayes. He wore a faded, grease-stained denim jacket, a threadbare t-shirt, and scuffed work boots. His meticulously groomed beard was grown out and unkempt. He drove a rented, beat-up 2010 Honda Civic with a sputtering exhaust and out-of-state plates. The humid Georgia heat rolled through the open windows of the Civic as Victor crossed the county line into Oak Haven. It was a picturesque, affluent southern town, manicured lawns, wrap-around porches, and a pristine town square. But underneath the veneer of southern hospitality lay a rigid, oppressive system of control. Victor intentionally drove 3 miles under the speed limit through an affluent neighborhood. He didn't have to wait long. Within 10 minutes, the flashing blue and red lights of an Oak Haven police cruiser illuminated his rearview mirror. Victor pulled over slowly, his heart maintaining a steady, disciplined rhythm. He rolled down the window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, exactly as he had instructed millions of citizens to do in public safety campaigns. A large, red-faced officer wearing dark aviator sunglasses approached the window. His hand was resting casually but menacingly on the butt of his sidearm. "License and registration, boy," Officer Miller barked, not bothering with a greeting or a reason for the stop. Victor handed over the forged, perfectly backstopped ID. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You're the problem," Miller sneered, shining a bright tactical flashlight directly into Victor's eyes despite it being 3 in the afternoon. "You match the description of a suspect involved in a string of burglaries in this neighborhood." It was a blatant, fabricated lie, a textbook pretextual stop. Victor knew the case law inside out. Wern v. United States. The officer was relying on Victor not knowing his rights. "I'm just passing through town, officer. I haven't been out of my vehicle." "Step out of the car, now." Miller's voice escalated, his hand unsnapping the holster of his weapon. Victor complied slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. As soon as his boots hit the pavement, Miller grabbed him roughly by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming his chest against the hot metal of the Honda's roof. "Hey, what are you doing?" Victor asked, injecting the perfect amount of civilian panic into his voice, while his trained mind analytically cataloged every constitutional violation occurring in real time. Fourth Amendment violation, unlawful search and seizure, excessive force. "Stop resisting," Miller yelled, kicking Victor's legs apart violently. He patted Victor down aggressively, finding nothing. Frustrated, the officer yanked Victor's arms behind his back, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting painfully into his wrists. They were ratcheted entirely too tight, cutting off circulation. "I'm not resisting," Victor said calmly. "You are now," Miller growled, shoving Victor toward the cruiser. "You're going downtown for failure to comply, resisting without violence, and loitering. Let's see how much you like Oak Haven hospitality." As Victor was shoved into the back of the cruiser, the smell of stale sweat and vomit assaulting his nostrils, he looked out the window. He was a man who commanded 35,000 federal agents, a man who briefed the president on global terror threats. Yet, in the back of this hot, cramped police car, he felt the heavy, suffocating weight of sheer powerlessness. It was a bitter, necessary medicine. He was in the system now. The trap was set. All he had to do was wait for the spider. The holding cell beneath the Oak Haven County Courthouse was a subterranean purgatory. The air was thick with the stench of open toilets, unwashed bodies, and the palpable metallic taste of fear. Fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting jaundiced shadows over the 30 men crammed into a space designed for 15. Victor sat on a cold, concrete bench, his back perfectly straight, his expression an unreadable mask of stoicism. He had been in the cell for 14 hours. The tight handcuffs from the arrest had left deep, purple bruising around his wrists. He blended perfectly with the other inmates, just another forgotten man swallowed by the machine. To his left, a young black teenager, barely 18, was weeping softly into his hands. "I just had a taillight out, man," the boy whispered to no one in particular. "They found a roach in my ashtray. My mama's gonna lose the house if I can't make bail." Victor felt a cold, hard knot tighten in his chest. This was the human cost of the spreadsheets he had read back in Washington. This was the blood that greased the wheels of Judge Vance's empire. He filed the boy's face away in his memory. When this was over, there would be pardons. There would be justice. But right now, he had to play his part. "Victor Hayes," a burly bailiff shouted, rattling the iron bars with a nightstick. "Up front. The Queen is ready for you." Victor stood, his muscles stiff from the night on concrete. He was chained at the wrists and ankles, attached to a line of 5 other men. They shuffled in a degrading, metallic procession up the concrete stairwell and into the bright, blinding light of courtroom 3B. The transition from the squalor of the holding cell to the opulence of the courtroom was jarring by design. The room was paneled in rich, dark mahogany. The Great Seal of the state of Georgia gleamed in solid brass behind the judge's bench. It was a theater constructed to intimidate, to make the defendant feel small, insignificant, and entirely at the mercy of the throne. Victor took his place in the jury box with the other chained men, waiting for his name to be called. This gave him the perfect vantage point to observe his target. Judge Mildred Vance entered from her private chambers, and the bailiff bellowed for the room to rise. Vance was a woman in her late 60s, with perfectly coiffed silver hair, sharp, aristocratic features, and eyes the color of winter ice. She wore her black silk robe not as a symbol of impartial justice, but as a monarch's cape. She exuded an aura of absolute, terrifying entitlement. For the next hour, Victor watched her work. It was a masterclass in judicial tyranny. She processed human beings with the cold efficiency of a slaughterhouse. She routinely denied public defenders the opportunity to speak, cutting them off with sharp, venomous reprimands. When a Hispanic man begged for leniency so he could keep his job to feed his children, Vance smiled a thin, cruel smile. "Your children should have thought of that before their father decided to become a criminal," she sneered, dropping the gavel. "Maximum sentence. Remanded to Oak Haven Correctional." Every time she sentenced someone to the private prison, Victor knew a wire transfer was being queued up for her offshore account. She was quite literally selling human beings for profit. The sheer audacity of the corruption made Victor's blood run cold. Case number 44-098. State versus Victor Hayes. The clerk called out. "Step up to the podium," the bailiff barked, unchaining Victor from the line but leaving his wrists shackled. Victor walked to the center of the room. He stood tall, projecting a quiet dignity that immediately drew the ire of the room. Defendants in Vance's court were supposed to slouch, to tremble, to beg. Victor did none of those things. Judge Vance looked down at the case file, then peered over her half-moon reading glasses at Victor. Her upper lip curled in profound disgust. She looked at him not as a citizen, not even as a human, but as a nuisance. A stray dog that had wandered into her immaculate garden. "Victor Hayes," she said, mispronouncing his assumed last name with deliberate disrespect. "I see you're charged with loitering, failure to comply with a lawful order, and resisting arrest without violence." "Typical." She leaned back, tapping a gold pin against her desk. "You people come into my county, think you can skulk around our neighborhoods, and then throw a temper tantrum when our fine officers ask you a simple question." "Your Honor," Victor began, his voice calm, respectful, but carrying a resonance that echoed to the back of the gallery. "I was pulled over without probable cause or reasonable, articulable suspicion. I was violently removed from my vehicle without provocation, in direct violation of my Fourth Amendment rights." The entire courtroom went dead silent. The public defender, a a sweaty, overworked young man, dropped his pen in horror. The bailiff's hand moved instinctively to his taser. Judge Vance stopped tapping her pen. Her ice-blue eyes widened in shock, followed rapidly by a dark, boiling fury. A defendant, let alone a black defendant in a thrift store jacket, did not cite constitutional law to her. They did not speak with such articulate, unyielding confidence. "Excuse me?" she hissed, leaning forward, the veins in her neck straining. "Did you just try to lecture me on the law in my courtroom?" "I am simply stating the facts of the arrest for the record, Your Honor. The police report states I matched a description, but fails to provide any specific details of said description, rendering the stop a pretextual violation under Terry v. Ohio." It was the perfect bait. Victor knew that narcissists in power could not handle public humiliation or a challenge to their intellect. Vance took the bait hook, line, and sinker. "You insolent, arrogant piece of trash," Vance spat, abandoning all pretense of judicial decorum. Her face was flushed dark red. "You think reading a pamphlet in a jailhouse library makes you a lawyer? You think those constitutional rights apply to you in my courtroom, boy? I believe the Constitution applies everywhere within the borders of the United States, Your Honor," Victor replied evenly. "Not here." She slammed her hand on the desk. "You are a thug in a cheap suit, and I am the law. I am holding you in direct contempt of court, 30 days in maximum security. Your Honor, I have a right to a reasonable bail for the underlying misdemeanor charges," Victor pressed, ensuring every violation was perfectly documented. "You want bail?" Vance laughed, a dry, wicked sound. "Fine. Bail is set at $250,000, cash only. Let's see if your attitude improves behind bars when you can't buy your way out." Remanded to Vanguard Correctional Facility. "Get this animal out of my sight." She slammed her gavel down with the force of a gunshot. The bailiff grabbed Victor violently by the arm, dragging him toward the side door. Victor didn't resist. As he was pulled away, he looked back at Judge Mildred Vance. She was already looking at the next file, having dismissed him entirely from her mind. Hidden inside the thick leather strap of Victor's cheap digital watch, a micro-transmitter was glowing a faint, invisible infrared. Everything, every insult, every blatant constitutional violation, every display of corrupt power had just been broadcast via encrypted satellite directly to the FBI command center. The Queen had spoken. Now, she was going to burn. The Oakhaven Correctional Facility, operated by Vanguard Corrections, sat on a desolate stretch of marshland 20 miles outside the city limits. It was a sprawling complex of razor wire, gray concrete, and automated gun towers. From the moment the reinforced steel gates slammed shut behind the transport bus, Victor knew he had entered a black site, a place where the law of the land was entirely superseded by the whims of the guards. The intake process was designed to strip away the last vestiges of human dignity. Victor was forced to strip naked in a freezing, concrete room alongside 10 other men, while guards in tactical gear shouted obscenities and mocked them. He was hosed down with freezing water, sprayed with harsh delousing chemicals that burned his skin, and issued an orange jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too small and smelled faintly of mildew and old sweat. As he was marched down the primary cell block, the sheer volume of the noise was a physical assault. The shouting of inmates, the metallic crashing of doors, the buzzing of the high-voltage perimeter fences, it was a symphony of institutionalized despair. He was shoved into cell 412, a cramped 6x8-foot concrete box. The heavy steel door rolled shut, with a finality that would have broken a lesser man. Victor stood in the center of the cell, taking a slow, measured breath. He centered himself, falling back on the survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, training he had undergone decades ago as a field agent. His cellmate was an older man with a face weathered like old leather and eyes that had seen too much darkness. He was sitting on the bottom bunk, reading a frayed paperback novel. "First time in the meat grinder?" the older man asked, not looking up from his book. "Something like that," Victor replied, taking the top bunk. "Victor Hayes." "Elias," the man grunted. "Don't bother unpacking your mental bags, Victor. If Vance sent you here, you're staying a while. She's got a quota to fill." "Quota?" Victor asked, playing the ignorant newcomer. Elias put his book down, letting out a heavy sigh. Vanguard gets paid per head, per night by the state. If the beds ain't full, Vanguard loses money. So, they pay Vance to keep 'em full. She denies bail, maxes out sentences, even on misdemeanors. I'm in here for possessing an ounce of marijuana. It's been 14 months, still waiting for a trial date. She set my bail at 50 grand. Might as well be 50 million. Victor's jaw tightened. 14 months of a man's life, stolen for a minor infraction, traded for a few $100s in kickbacks. He looked around the cell. The toilet was cracked and leaking. Black mold grew in the corners of the ceiling. The air conditioning was broken, making the cell a suffocating hotbox. For the next 48 hours, Victor lived the reality of the people he had sworn to protect. He ate the spoiled gray food that caused vicious stomach cramps. He witnessed the guards beat a mentally ill inmate senseless for failing to stand for account. He felt the terrifying, claustrophobic vulnerability of being entirely cut off from the outside world. He allowed himself to experience it fully. He needed to feel the anger. He needed to internalize the injustice so that when the time came, his hand would not hesitate to wield the full, devastating power of the federal government. On the third night, during recreation hour in the yard, Victor walked the perimeter fence alone. He approached a blind spot near the western watchtower, a coordinate pre-arranged with his team. A guard, a large man with a thick mustache, walked by the fence line on the outside. He didn't look at Victor, but as he passed, a small, black object wrapped in electrical tape fell from his pocket through the chain-link fence, landing softly in the dirt. The guard kept walking. He was one of Marcus Thorne's undercover operatives, planted weeks ago. Victor smoothly scooped up the object, palming it seamlessly, and continued his walk. Back in the suffocating privacy of his cell, while Elias slept, Victor unwrapped the tape. Inside was a high-grade, encrypted satellite burner phone, no bigger than a credit card. He powered it on. The biometric scanner read his thumbprint, and the screen glowed green. He dialed a secure sequence. "Director," Marcus Thorne's voice came through the earpiece, crisp and relieved. "Status?" "Alive and well, Marcus." Though the accommodations leave much to be desired, Victor whispered, his eyes watching the cell door window for any passing shadows. "Do we have the final piece?" "We do," Thorne confirmed, the excitement palpable in his voice. "The moment she sentenced you and remanded you to Vanguard, we traced a wire transfer. $1,500 hit the Cayman account from a Vanguard shell company. We have the audio of her court proceedings from your watch. We have her denying bail illegally. We have the civil rights violations on tape. The Department of Justice has greenlit the warrants. We have 75 tactical agents on standby, plus the financial crimes unit." "Good." Victor's voice was ice. "She scheduled my preliminary hearing for tomorrow morning. She wants to make an example of me in open court. We will breach the courthouse at 0900 hours, exactly when your hearing begins," Thorne said. "Do you want us to pull you out of the prison tonight?" Victor looked over at Elias, who was shivering in his sleep on the thin, stained mattress. He thought of the young teenager crying in the holding cell. He thought of the blood money padding Judge Vance's bank accounts while human beings rotted in concrete boxes. "No," Victor said, his voice hard, vibrating with an unyielding sense of purpose. "Leave me in the system. I want to ride the chain gang bus back to the courthouse tomorrow. I want her to look down from her bench and see the broken man she thinks she created. I want her to look me in the eye when the doors kick open." "Understood, Director. We'll see you in court." Victor powered down the phone and hid it inside the hollow metal leg of his bunk. He lay back on his thin mattress, staring at the cracked concrete ceiling. The trap had closed. The evidence was secured. Tomorrow, Judge Mildred Vance was going to learn a harsh, unforgettable lesson. When you build an empire by hunting the vulnerable, you pray to God that one of your victims isn't the apex predator in disguise. At 4 a.m., the Vanguard Correctional Facility woke its inhabitants not with a gentle alarm, but with a deafening, mechanical klaxon that reverberated through the concrete marrow of the cell block. The sound was an auditory assault designed to disorient and terrify, instantly flooding the nervous system with cortisol. Victor's eyes snapped open in the pitch black of cell 412. He had been awake for an hour, lying in the suffocating heat, listening to the agonizing symphony of the prison, The coughing, the muffled sobbing, the relentless, predatory pacing of men trapped in cages. He sat up, his spine cracking in protest against the thin, sweat-stained mattress. Beneath him, Elias groaned, a hollow, rattling sound that spoke of broken ribs and a shattered spirit. "Chow in 5, on the doors." A guard bellowed from the catwalk, striking the steel railings with a heavy wooden baton. The morning routine was a masterclass in dehumanization. Victor and the other inmates scheduled for court appearances were herded into a brightly lit, freezing staging area. They were forced to strip naked once again, subjected to humiliating cavity searches under the guise of security, before being tossed their heavily starched, abrasive orange jumpsuits. Then came the chains. A vanguard guard, a man whose name tag read Dixon, and whose eyes held a dull, sadistic gleam, approached Victor. He wrapped a heavy, oxidized steel chain around Victor's waist, securing it with a massive padlock. Next, handcuffs were clamped onto Victor's wrists, then threaded through a steel loop at his navel, forcing his arms into a perpetual, unnatural bow. Finally, leg irons were locked onto his ankles, the heavy chain dragging on the concrete floor. "You think you're smart, Hayes?" Dixon muttered, pulling the waist chain violently tight, deliberately pinching Victor's flesh beneath the orange fabric. "Word from the courthouse is you like to talk back to the Queen. Bad move, boy. You're going to belong to us for a very, very long time." Victor did not wince. He simply looked down at Dixon, his dark eyes entirely devoid of fear. It was a gaze that had unnerved hardened cartel bosses and international terrorists, and for a fleeting second, the vanguard guard faltered. Dixon quickly masked his unease with a scowl, shoving Victor toward the transport door. "Move it, smartass." The transport bus was a rolling sarcophagus. It was a retrofitted school bus, painted a dull, authoritarian gray. The windows were covered in heavy steel mesh, completely obscuring the outside world, while the interior smelled potently of diesel fumes, stale urine, and fear. The seats were hard fiberglass, offering no traction or comfort. Victor was chained to Elias, who had a preliminary hearing for his endless, fabricated marijuana charge. The older man was trembling, his breathing shallow. As the bus lurched forward, navigating the treacherous dirt roads leading away from the marshland, the inmates were thrown violently against one another. With their hands bound to their waists, they had no way to brace themselves. "She's going to deny my public defender's motion again," Elias whispered, staring blankly at the metal grate separating them from the armed driver. "She always does. She's going to set a trial date for next year and send me right back to this hellhole." "Hold on, Elias," Victor said quietly, his voice a steady, grounding anchor in the chaotic, rattling bus. "Things are going to change today, I promise you." Elias let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You got a good heart, Victor, but you don't understand Oakhaven. There ain't no justice here. The law is just a net they throw over people like us. The big fish swim right through it. The little ones get caught and sold." Victor turned his head, looking through the tiny, diamond-shaped gaps in the steel mesh on the window. The oppressive, swampy marshland of the prison grounds slowly gave way to the manicured, opulent outskirts of Oakhaven. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the Georgia sky in brilliant hues of coral and gold. He watched a wealthy man jogging along a pristine sidewalk, a golden retriever bounding happily by his side. It was a picture of perfect, idyllic American life. It made Victor sick to his stomach. The contrast was abhorrent. A few miles away, American citizens were being sold into modern-day slavery to line the pockets of a corrupt judge, while the rest of the town drank artisanal coffee and lived in blissful, willful ignorance. This was exactly why Victor had taken the job as director of the FBI. The Bureau had spent decades focusing on federal threats, on terrorism and high-level espionage, often overlooking the insidious, deeply rooted corruption that strangled local communities. No more, Victor thought, the rhythm of the bus tires echoing his resolve. Today, the federal government is coming to Oakhaven. As the bus pulled into the subterranean loading dock of the Oakhaven County Courthouse, the heavy steel doors rolling shut behind them, Victor felt the faint, rhythmic pulse of adrenaline in his veins. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, shifting his mindset. He buried Victor Blackwood, the director. He fully embodied Victor Hayes, the victim. It was time to step into the Queen's court. The holding cells beneath the courtroom were just as vile as they had been 3 days prior, but today, there was a palpable, frantic energy in the air. This was the day Judge Mildred Vance held her preliminary hearings, what the local defense attorneys cynically referred to as the slaughter. Victor sat on the cold concrete bench, his chains rattling softly with every breath. Across from him sat his assigned public defender, Thomas Reed. Reed was a young, gaunt man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit. He had dark circles under his eyes that spoke of 80-hour work weeks, a crushing caseload, and a dying sense of idealism. He held Victor's paper file with trembling, sweat-slicked hands. "Okay, Mr. Hayes," Reed stammered, adjusting his glasses. "I'm going to shoot straight with you. Judge Vance is. She is severely displeased with your conduct during your initial appearance. You humiliated her on the record. That is a death sentence in her court." "I asserted my constitutional rights, Mr. Reed," Victor replied calmly. "Is that considered a crime in Oakhaven? In courtroom 3B? "Yes, absolutely," Reed hissed, leaning in close, his eyes darting toward the guards pacing the hallway. "Look, I've negotiated a deal with the district attorney. If you plead guilty to the resisting charge and apologize profusely to the judge, they'll drop the loitering charge. You'll get 6 months in Vanguard, but with good behavior, maybe you're out in 4. It's the best I can do." Victor looked at the young lawyer. He saw a man who had been entirely beaten into submission by a corrupt system. Reed wasn't fighting for his clients anymore. He was just facilitating their processing to avoid Vance's wrath. "I will not plead guilty to a fabricated charge," Victor said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "I want to proceed with the hearing. I want the arresting officer to take the stand under oath." Reed looked as if he was about to cry. "You are committing suicide, Hayes. She will hit you with the maximum penalty. She might even tack on consecutive charges. You don't understand the power this woman has." "I understand power perfectly, Mr. Reed," Victor said, standing up as the cell door buzzed open. "Let's go." Victor was marched up the concrete stairwell, the heavy chains dragging, creating a haunting, metallic rhythm. As he stepped into courtroom 3B, the blinding light momentarily seared his retinas. The gallery was packed today. Families of the defendants sat nervously on the wooden pews, clutching rosaries and tissue boxes. In the front row, directly behind the prosecution's table, sat a man in a tailored, pale blue suit. Victor recognized him immediately from the FBI dossier. Calvin Brooks, the district attorney of Oakhaven County. He was leaning back, chatting amiably with the bailiff, a relaxed, predatory smile on his face. This wasn't a court of law to them, it was an ATM machine. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, his voice booming over the quiet murmurs of the gallery. "The Honorable Judge Mildred Vance presiding. Court is now in session." Judge Vance emerged from her chambers. If Victor thought she looked arrogant 3 days ago, today she looked absolutely imperial. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a subtle, expensive pearl necklace over her black robes. She took her seat with the practiced grace of a monarch ascending a throne. She didn't look at the gallery. She didn't look at the defense attorneys. She looked at her docket, picking up her gold pin. "Let's get through this quickly, people." "I have a luncheon at noon," Vance announced, her voice dripping with profound boredom. She began tearing through the docket. It was a horrifying spectacle of assembly line injustice. A mother of 3, arrested for shoplifting baby formula, was denied a public defender because she supposedly made $10 over the poverty line. Vance sentenced her to 90 days in Vanguard. Next was Elias. His public defender asked for a dismissal due to lack of evidence. Vance didn't even let the lawyer finish his sentence. Motion denied. Trial date set for next March. Remanded without bail. Elias looked back at Victor as he was dragged away, his eyes hollow, utterly devoid of hope. Victor's hands clenched into fists, the steel cuffs biting deeply into his bruised wrists. His internal clock was ticking. It was 8:45 a.m. Case number 44-098. State versus Victor Hayes. The clerk called out. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Even District Attorney Brooks sat up a little straighter. Word had spread through the courthouse about the homeless drifter who had dared to lecture the Queen. "Bring him up," Vance commanded, not looking up from her file. The bailiff grabbed Victor's arm, roughly hauling him forward until he stood at the defense podium. Thomas Reed stood beside him, physically shaking. Judge Vance finally looked up. Her ice-blue eyes locked onto Victor, and a slow, incredibly cruel smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a cat that had finally cornered a severely injured mouse. Well, Mr. Hayes, Vance purred, her voice carrying easily through the silent courtroom. Did you enjoy your stay at Vanguard Correctional? Did you find their law library to your liking, or were you too busy learning how the real world works? The facilities are in direct violation of the Eighth Amendment's protection against cruel and unusual punishment, Your Honor, Victor said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that commanded the acoustics of the room. But I suspect you already know that, given your financial stake in them. The entire courtroom gasped. Thomas Reed practically collapsed against the podium. District Attorney Brooks dropped his pen. Judge Vance's cruel smile vanished, replaced instantly by a look of sheer, apocalyptic rage. The veins in her neck bulged against her pearl necklace. Her hand flew to her gavel, gripping it with white-knuckled fury. She leaned over the bench, her eyes wide, burning with absolute hatred. "You insolent, filthy animal," Vance hissed, all pretense of judicial protocol evaporating into the humid Georgia air. "How dare you speak to me that way? I am going to bury you under this courthouse. I am going to make sure you never see the light of day again." "Are you entering that threat into the official record, Your Honor?" Victor asked calmly, adjusting his posture, standing tall and imposing despite his heavy chains. The trap was fully sprung. The clock ticked to 8:58 a.m. "I am holding you in contempt of court," Judge Vance screamed, her composure entirely shattered. She was slamming her gavel onto the sounding block repeatedly, the sharp, percussive cracks echoing like gunfire. "That is an additional year in Vanguard. No bail, no appeals, and if your pathetic lawyer says one word, I will hold him in contempt too." Thomas Reed threw his hands up, taking a terrified step away from Victor, effectively abandoning him. District Attorney Calvin Brooks stood up, buttoning his pale blue suit, sensing an opportunity to perform for the judge. "Your Honor, the state requests that the defendant be immediately restrained. He is clearly exhibiting dangerous, sociopathic behavior and poses a threat to this court." "Bailiff, tase him," Vance shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Victor. "Put him on the ground right now." The massive bailiff unholstered his bright yellow taser, stepping aggressively toward Victor. "Get on your knees, boy," he barked, leveling the weapon at Victor's chest. Victor did not move. He did not drop to his knees. He simply stood his ground, his eyes locked onto the large antique clock hanging on the oak-paneled wall above the double doors of the courtroom. The second hand ticked its final rotation. It was 9 a.m. exactly. Before the bailiff could pull the trigger, a sound like a thunderclap violently shook the building. Boom! The massive, solid oak double doors at the back of courtroom 3B did not just open. They were violently blown off their hinges by a tactical battering ram. The heavy wood splintered and crashed into the gallery pews. Screams erupted from the terrified spectators as they dove to the floor. "FBI, nobody move. Federal agents." The shout was deafening, amplified by bullhorns. In an instant, the courtroom was flooded. 36 men and women dressed in heavy black tactical armor poured into the room with terrifying, practiced precision. They moved like a single, lethal organism. Helmets, ballistic vests emblazoned with massive yellow FBI letters, and short-barreled M4 carbines leveled at every strategic point in the room. "Drop the weapon. Drop it now," two heavily armored agents screamed, aiming laser sights directly at the chest of the bailiff. The bailiff, realizing instantly that his county badge meant absolutely nothing against the might of the federal government's elite hostage rescue team, dropped his taser as if it were radioactive and threw his hands into the air, falling to his knees. Chaos reigned. District Attorney Brooks tried to bolt toward the side exit, but an FBI agent slammed him violently against the mahogany wall, zip-tying his wrists in seconds. The local police officers in the room were immediately disarmed and forced to the ground. Through the sea of black armor, a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit walked slowly down the center aisle. Special Agent Marcus Thorne looked every bit the seasoned, lethal veteran he was. He carried a thick black leather folder under his arm. Judge Vance was standing behind her bench, frozen in a state of absolute, uncomprehending shock. Her mouth was open, her chest heaving. She looked from the tactical agents, to her arrested district attorney, to the man in the suit approaching her bench. What is the meaning of this? Vance finally managed to screech, her voice cracking with terror. This is a state courtroom. You have no jurisdiction here. I am a superior court judge. Marcus Thorne stopped at the prosecutor's table. He looked up at Vance with an expression of profound disgust. He didn't answer her. Instead, he turned his attention to the man in the orange jumpsuit standing at the defense podium. Thorne produced a small, silver key from his pocket. He walked over to Victor, bypassing the terrified public defender. With quick, efficient movements, Thorne unlocked the heavy padlock on Victor's waist chain. He unlocked the handcuffs. He knelt and unlocked the leg irons. The heavy steel chains fell to the courtroom floor with a loud, ringing crash. "Director," Thorne said respectfully, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly dead-silent courtroom. "The perimeter is secure. The Financial Crimes Unit is currently raiding Vanguard headquarters in Atlanta. The DOJ has authorized all federal warrants." Judge Mildred Vance's breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes darted frantically from Thorne, the immaculately dressed federal agent, to the homeless drifter in the orange jumpsuit. Her brain simply could not process the information. Victor Blackwood rolled his shoulders, working the stiffness out of his joints. He rubbed his bruised wrists, feeling the blood finally circulate back into his hands. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the persona of Victor Hayes evaporate entirely. The stoic, broken inmate vanished. In his place stood a man of terrifying, absolute authority. Victor slowly walked up the steps toward the judge's bench. 2 FBI agents immediately flanked him, their rifles held at the low ready. Vance stumbled backward, her legs hitting her leather chair. She looked up at the towering figure of the black man she had spent the last 3 days degrading, insulting, and throwing into a cage. The realization hit her like a physical blow, draining every ounce of blood from her face. She began to tremble violently. "You," Vance whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can't be." "My name is Victor Blackwood," Victor said, his baritone voice echoing off the mahogany walls, cold and unyielding as a steel vault. "I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and you, Mildred Vance, are under arrest." He gestured to Thorne, who stepped forward and opened the black folder. "Mildred Vance," Thorne read clearly. "You are hereby under federal arrest for violation of Title 18, U.S.C., Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. You are also charged with 34 counts of federal bribery, 72 counts of wire fraud, and racketeering under the RICO Act. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it." "No, no, no, no," Vance whimpered, tears of absolute panic streaming down her perfectly powdered cheeks, ruining her makeup. "This is a mistake. I am the law here. I have friends. I know the governor. The governor is currently reading a brief drafted by my office outlining your crimes," Victor said, leaning slightly over the bench, bringing his face close to hers. "Your friends are currently being handcuffed by my agents. Your offshore bank accounts in the Caymans have been frozen and seized by the Treasury Department. Your empire is gone, Mildred." Vance let out a guttural, wretched sob, collapsing back into her leather chair. She wasn't a monarch anymore. She was just a corrupt, pathetic criminal who had finally been caught in her own trap. "Take her," Victor commanded softly. 2 female FBI agents ascended the bench. They grabbed the judge by her arms, roughly hoisting her to her feet. They didn't use the padded, comfortable police cuffs she was used to issuing. They used cold, heavy steel federal handcuffs. As they clicked tightly around Vance's wrists behind her back, the sound echoed in the silent courtroom like a final, definitive judgment. Victor stood at the bench, looking down at the gallery. The families of the defendants were staring at him in stunned, tearful disbelief. He looked at the gallery doors, where agents were currently escorting Elias and the mother of 3 out of their holding cells, cutting their chains. The queen had fallen. Now, it was time to tear down the rest of the castle. In the cold, unyielding Atlanta FBI field office, Mildred Vance sat shackled to an aluminum table. The rapid transition from rural monarch to federal inmate had aged her instantly. Her silk robes were gone, replaced by a scratchy federal holding jumpsuit. The heavy steel door opened, and Victor Blackwood walked in, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. He tossed a thick manila folder onto the table. "You engaged in entrapment," Vance croaked, her former authority shattered. This was an illegal sting. Victor's voice was ice. "The Hobbs Act carries 20 years per count. We have you on tape denying bail to enrich yourself. Your offshore accounts are frozen, and your sister-in-law flipped. She gave us the ledgers. We know about every dime Vanguard paid you to keep their beds full." Vance's face drained of color as Victor spread out the undeniable paper trail. Her pride shattered completely, and she strained against her chains in a panic. "Please, Director, I'll resign. Just don't send me to prison. I won't survive in there." Victor looked at her with unyielding granite. "You asked if constitutional rights applied in your court. Federal sentencing guidelines will apply in mine. You are going to FMC Carswell." He walked out, sealing her in the unforgiving reality she had denied so many. The next morning, Oakhaven County transformed into a chaotic federal staging ground. News helicopters circled as the headline flashed nationwide. FBI director infiltrates corrupt courtroom, judge arrested. While agents seized the courthouse and digitized Vance's corrupt case files, a different revolution happened 20 miles away. The gates of Vanguard Correctional opened. Nonviolent offenders, freed by emergency DOJ petitions, walked into the sunlight. Victor, now wearing an FBI windbreaker, found Elias in the bewildered crowd and embraced him. "I told you things would change," Victor said. Elias stared in awe. "You were the director the whole time." Victor handed Elias a thick envelope. "The DOJ has fast-tracked your exoneration. Inside is the contact info for a civil rights firm. You'll receive a settlement that ensures you'll never worry about money again." Elias wept, overwhelmed by his restored freedom and the lengths Victor went to secure it. "You didn't have to wear those chains." "Yes, I did," Victor replied. "I needed to feel the chains so I would never hesitate to break them." The machine was broken, but one final reckoning remained. 6 months later, in an Atlanta federal court, a broken, shackled Mildred Vance shuffled to the defense table. She was a ghost of the terrifying Queen of Oakhaven. Behind her sat dozens of her former victims, including Victor and Elias. Federal Judge Arthur Harrison presided over the sentencing phase for her Hobbs Act and racketeering convictions. When asked for a victim impact statement, Victor confidently approached the podium. The defendant weaponized the law against the most vulnerable to fund offshore accounts. Victor commanded the room, looking directly at Vance. "The true cost is sitting in these pews. She promised to bury me because she believed her power was absolute. We ask you to give her the same compassion she gave her victims. Absolutely none." Judge Harrison glared down at the disgraced judge. "You used the gavel as an auctioneer's hammer. I am sentencing you to 20 years in federal prison. There is no parole." Crack! The gavel slammed like a thunderclap. Vance let out an agonizing wail, her legs giving out completely as U.S. Marshals dragged her away. Beside Victor, Elias smiled through his tears. The scales of justice were finally balanced. This wasn't merely a story of corruption, it's a devastating reminder of what happens when absolute power meets absolute justice. Judge Vance thought she was an untouchable predator, but karma wore a cheap suit, heavy chains, and carried the unyielding might of the FBI. If this story of undercover justice and righteous retribution made your blood pump, hit that like button. Share this video to remind people the bad guys don't always win, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories. Stay vigilant, and we'll see you in the next one.